At my own son's wedding, they removed my seat from the family table and replaced it with a silver trash can. I stood there for a moment holding my evening purse against my chest, staring at the polished metal bin sitting exactly where my name card should have been. Around me, crystal chandeliers glowed warmly above the ballroom, and waiters in black tuxedos moved between tables carrying trays of champagne. Somewhere near the dance floor, a string quartet was playing softly, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. The wedding planner glanced at me with visible discomfort before quickly looking away. A few guests noticed too. One woman lowered her wine glass, slowly, while whispering something to her husband. Another pretended not to stare. I looked down at the seating chart again, hoping perhaps there had been some mistake. But there it was in elegant gold lettering. Evelyn Carter. Table 1. Except Table 1 no longer had a chair for me. Just the trash can. Nicole approached before I could say anything. My daughter-in-law looked flawless in her ivory satin gown, every blonde curl perfectly pinned into place. "Oh goodness," she said with a little laugh that didn't reach her eyes. There must have been some mix-up with the venue staff. I noticed she never sounded surprised. Not really. Behind her, my son Ryan adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo and avoided looking directly at me. That hurt more than the trash can ever could. "We can probably squeeze another chair somewhere," Nicole added lightly, as if she were discussing an extra napkin instead of humiliating me in front of 300 guests. I smiled gently and smoothed the wrinkles from my navy blue dress. Robert used to say navy made me look dignified. My late husband had been gone for almost 6 years now, but standing there in the middle of that ballroom, I missed him so badly my chest physically ached. Robert would have never allowed this. "It's all right," I said quietly. "I'm sure the staff is overwhelmed." Nicole visibly relaxed. Ryan exhaled too, though he still wouldn't meet my eyes. A young waiter hurried over and placed a folding chair near the service entrance beside the swinging kitchen doors. Every time the staff walked through them, bursts of steam and noise spilled into the ballroom. I walked over slowly and sat down without complaint. The folding chair wobbled slightly beneath me. Across the room, I could see the family table glowing beneath candlelight and white roses. My son laughed at something Nicole whispered into his ear. Not once did he turn toward me. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and stared at the trash can sitting in my place. Funny thing about humiliation. When it's done publicly enough, something inside you stops breaking and starts hardening instead. I stayed in that folding chair through the entire ceremony. Every time the kitchen door swung open behind me, I caught the smell of roasted chicken, butter, and warm bread drifting into the ballroom. The servers moved around me as though I were part of the furniture. One young waitress nearly bumped into my shoulder while carrying a tray of champagne flutes. She apologized softly, her cheeks turning pink, and I smiled to let her know it was all right. Embarrassment should belong to the people who create humiliation, not the strangers forced to witness it. Across the ballroom, Nicole stood beneath a canopy of white roses while Ryan held her hands and repeated vows he barely seemed present enough to understand. He looked exhausted. Not unhappy exactly, just distant. I had noticed that expression appearing more and more over the last 2 years. The first time I saw it clearly was shortly after Nicole moved into the family home during renovations on their condo downtown. At first, she had been charming. She brought lemon pastries from a bakery near Lakeshore Drive and insisted on helping me cook dinner. She called me Miss Evelyn in that sweet, polished voice of hers and complimented every piece of furniture in the house. But sweetness can be a costume. Some people wear it only until they find the keys to the front door. After Robert passed away, the house became painfully quiet. 40 years of marriage leaves echoes in every room. His reading glasses still sat in the kitchen drawer because I could not bring myself to move them. His old leather chair remained beside the fireplace, untouched. Grief changes the temperature of a home. Ryan knew that. At least I thought he did. I paid for his college tuition, helped him through law school. When Nicole wanted a vineyard wedding that cost more than my first house back in 1978, I quietly wrote another check. Nearly $80,000. I never mentioned it afterward because love is not supposed to sound like an invoice. During the reception dinner, the master of ceremonies thanked Nicole's parents 3 separate times for making this magical evening possible. I watched Nicole's mother dab carefully at the corners of her eyes while guests applauded. Nobody mentioned me. Not once. I reached for my water glass and realized my hands were trembling slightly. so I folded them together beneath the tablecloth instead. The photographers moved from table to table capturing family portraits. Every branch of Nicole's family gathered smiling beneath the chandeliers. Cousins, aunts, college friends, even distant relatives flown in from Arizona. When they finally called for the Carter family photo, Ryan glanced briefly in my direction before Nicole leaned close and whispered something into his ear. He hesitated. Then the photographer waved impatiently, and Ryan turned away without me. The picture was taken in less than 30 seconds. My own son standing beneath white roses while pretending I did not exist. I looked down toward the dance floor afterward and noticed something strange. The silver trash can had been removed from table 1. Someone had quietly taken it away while the guests were distracted. But the empty space where my chair should have been remained untouched. The reception slowly grew louder as the evening stretched on. Champagne loosened voices. Laughter bounced against the ballroom walls. Crystal glasses clinked beneath the chandeliers while the band shifted into old jazz standards Robert used to love. I sat quietly near the kitchen doors, watching people celebrate a marriage that already felt strangely hollow to me. There are moments when a person suddenly realizes they are no longer standing inside their own family. They are only standing near it. I noticed Ryan checking his phone constantly throughout dinner. Nicole would touch his arm every few minutes, smiling brightly whenever guests looked their way. But the second their attention drifted elsewhere, her expression flattened into irritation. At one point, she leaned close and whispered sharply enough for me to notice the tension in her jaw. Ryan nodded immediately like a tired employee responding to a demanding supervisor. It reminded me of my late husband during the final year of his illness. Robert had once told me something while sitting on our back porch during a thunderstorm. Control does not always sound loud, Evelyn, he said quietly. Sometimes it sounds reasonable. I did not fully understand what he meant back then. I understood it now. Around 8:30, guests began moving toward the dance floor for speeches. Nicole's father stood first. He joked about expensive weddings and daughters who always get their way. Everyone laughed politely. Then Nicole's maid of honor spoke about ambition, appearances, and building the perfect future. I found that phrase interesting. Building the perfect future. Some people are willing to remove anyone who does not match the image they are trying to create. Ryan finally stood holding a champagne glass in slightly trembling hands. For one hopeful second, I thought perhaps he might acknowledge me. Maybe thank me for helping make the evening possible. Maybe remember that before the expensive ballroom and polished tuxedo and imported flowers, there had been a widowed woman quietly writing checks at her dining room table. Instead, he cleared his throat and thanked Nicole for bringing stability into his life. Stability. The word settled heavily in my chest. I lowered my eyes toward my lap before anyone could see the disappointment on my face. Grace Whitmore slid into the empty folding chair beside me a few moments later. Grace had been my closest friend for over 30 years. We survived pregnancies together, funerals together, and the kind of disappointments women our age rarely talk about out loud. She adjusted the pearl bracelet on her wrist and stared toward the dance floor without speaking at first. I saw what they did earlier, she finally said softly. I gave a small shrug. It is their wedding. Grace turned slowly toward me. No, Evelyn, she said. That was not wedding stress. That was cruelty. I stayed silent. Sometimes naming something makes it harder to ignore. Grace leaned closer then, lowering her voice. About 20 minutes ago, I overheard Nicole speaking with her mother near the ladies' room. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten immediately. Across the ballroom, Nicole laughed as photographers gathered around her table again. Grace continued quietly. Nicole said once the honeymoon is over, they need to start convincing you to move into assisted living before the holidays. My fingers tightened around the edge of my napkin. And that is not even the worst part, Grace whispered. Grace kept her voice low while the band played softly across the ballroom. Around us, guests laughed over slices of wedding cake, served on white porcelain plates trimmed with gold. The smell of vanilla frosting and coffee drifted through the air, mixing strangely with the tightness growing in my chest. Nicole said they cannot move forward with the lake house until your name is removed from the trust. Grace whispered carefully. I stared at her without fully understanding at first. What lake house? I asked quietly. Grace blinked. Evelyn, do not tell me you did not know. The room suddenly felt warmer. Too warm. I loosened my fingers from around my napkin and sat very still. Grace looked genuinely unsettled now. Nicole told her mother Ryan would finally inherit Robert's vacation property once they convinced you to sign new paperwork after the honeymoon. I felt something cold move slowly through my stomach. Robert never owned a lake house. In 40 years of marriage, there had never been any secret property hidden away somewhere. We owned our family home in Illinois and a small retirement condo in Naples, Florida. Nothing else. That does not make sense, I said softly. Grace leaned closer. There is more. I looked toward the dance floor where Ryan and Nicole were smiling for another photographer. Nicole rested one manicured hand against Ryan's chest while he looked distracted, tired, almost absent inside his own wedding. Nicole called you the lonely old wallet, Grace said quietly. She said once you move out of the house, everything else will become easier. I lowered my eyes to the untouched coffee sitting in front of me. The surface trembled slightly from the vibration of the music. Lonely old wallet. Strange how insults hurt less when they confirm something you already feared might be true. Suddenly, moments from the past 2 years began sliding together inside my mind like puzzle pieces finally locking into place. Nicole insisting I should simplify my finances because paperwork becomes confusing at your age. Ryan encouraging me to let him help review my bank statements. Nicole repeatedly asking whether Robert had updated his trust before he passed away. The conversations had always sounded casual, helpful even, but now every word felt rehearsed, planned, deliberate. Grace reached into her handbag slowly and pulled out a sealed cream-colored envelope. I was not sure whether to give you this tonight, she admitted quietly. But after what they did to you earlier, I think you deserve to know. I stared down at the envelope resting between us on the tablecloth. My full name was written across the front in familiar handwriting. Daniel Mercer, Robert's attorney, a man we had trusted for over 20 years. Daniel gave this to me at the country club last week, Grace explained. He said if anything strange happened tonight, I should make certain you received it privately. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. That frightened me more than panic would have. Calm can sometimes mean the body already understands the danger before the mind fully catches up. Across the ballroom, Nicole raised a champagne glass while guests applauded another toast. The chandeliers reflected against the crystals hanging from her earrings, making her sparkle beneath the lights like something expensive and carefully polished. I picked up the envelope slowly and traced my fingers along the sealed edge. Then I looked back toward my son. Ryan finally glanced in my direction for the first time all evening. But the moment our eyes met, he looked away again. I did not open the envelope immediately. Instead, I placed it carefully beside my clutch purse and watched the dance floor for another minute. Nicole was laughing again, one hand resting possessively on Ryan's arm while guests circled around them with champagne glasses raised high. The band had shifted into a slow Frank Sinatra song Robert used to hum while making coffee on Sunday mornings. For a brief second, I could almost picture him standing beside me in that ballroom, tall and calm in one of his charcoal suits, quietly noticing everything the way he always did. Robert never missed details. That was why he survived 30 years in corporate law without becoming cruel. He understood that the most dangerous people are rarely emotional. They are patient. Grace touched my wrist gently. You should read it, she whispered. I nodded slowly and slid one finger beneath the seal. Inside were several folded documents and a handwritten note from Daniel Mercer. The first line made my stomach tighten immediately. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then certain concerns Robert once shared with me were likely justified. I blinked slowly and continued reading beneath the warm glow of the ballroom lights. Robert had updated the Carter family trust 6 months before his death. I remembered the appointment vaguely because afterward he insisted we drive 2 hours north just to eat pie at a small diner near Lake Geneva. At the time, I assumed he was simply organizing retirement paperwork. I had no idea he was protecting me. According to the documents in my hands, the majority of our family assets remained fully under my control for the duration of my lifetime. The Illinois property, the Florida condo, investment accounts, corporate shares, everything. Ryan was listed only as a future beneficiary under specific conditions outlined in the trust. One sentence had been underlined in blue ink by Daniel himself. Any demonstrated financial coercion, manipulation, or intentional isolation directed toward Evelyn Carter shall result in immediate suspension of inheritance privileges pending legal review. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The ballroom noise faded strangely around me after that. Suddenly, Nicole's behavior over the past 2 years no longer felt personal. It felt strategic. Every forced smile, every carefully timed suggestion, every conversation about simplifying finances or discussing retirement communities. She had not been trying to build a relationship with me. She had been trying to manage an obstacle. I lowered the papers slowly and noticed my hands had stopped trembling altogether. Across the room, Ryan was thanking guests near the bar while Nicole spoke animatedly with her parents. She looked radiant beneath the crystal lights, but now I could see something beneath the polish. Hunger. The kind that never disappears no matter how much money or admiration someone receives. Grace leaned closer again. "There is another page," she said softly. I unfolded the final document and felt my pulse slow even further. Robert had included a private instruction for Daniel Mercer. If at any point Evelyn appears pressured, excluded, manipulated, or emotionally distressed by family members seeking financial access, ensure she regains full, independent legal protection immediately. I stared at Robert's signature at the bottom of the page. Strong, steady, certain. Even dying, my husband had seen farther ahead than I did. A soft burst of laughter erupted from Nicole's table across the ballroom. She tilted her head back gracefully while one of her bridesmaids whispered something into her ear. Then Nicole glanced briefly toward me. For the first time all evening, her smile faltered slightly. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. I folded the documents carefully and slid them back into the envelope while the wedding reception continued around me as though nothing had changed. The strange thing about discovering the truth is that the world does not pause to acknowledge it. Music still played. Glasses still clinked. Guests still laughed beneath the chandeliers while waiters carried tiny desserts across the ballroom on silver trays. But inside me, something had shifted permanently. I was no longer sitting in that folding chair as a confused old woman being quietly pushed aside. I was sitting there as the legal owner of everything Nicole believed. She was about to control. Grace studied my face carefully. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. I surprised myself by smiling. "Actually," I said, smoothing the front of my navy dress, "I think I finally am." Grace blinked at me for a moment before letting out a quiet breath of relief. Across the ballroom, Nicole was greeting another group of guests with polished elegance. She kissed cheeks, accepted compliments, adjusted her diamond bracelet beneath the lights. Every movement looked rehearsed, curated, like someone performing the role of a perfect bride for an invisible audience. I suddenly remembered something Robert once told me after a charity gala years ago. People who build their lives around appearances eventually panic when reality enters the room. At the time, I thought he was talking about politics. Now I understood he had spent years observing human nature more carefully than I ever had. Ryan approached my table unexpectedly around 9:15, carrying 2 champagne glasses. He looked tired up close. The skin beneath his eyes had darkened noticeably over the past year, and faint lines now rested permanently across his forehead. Stress leaves fingerprints on people even when they pretend otherwise. "Mom," he said quietly, handing me a glass. "I know tonight has been a little chaotic." Chaotic. Such a gentle word for humiliation. I accepted the champagne anyway. "Weddings usually are," I replied calmly. Ryan nodded awkwardly and glanced toward Nicole before lowering his voice slightly. Nicole gets overwhelmed when things are not perfect. I almost laughed at the irony of that sentence. Instead, I took a small sip of champagne and looked directly at my son for the first time all evening. "Ryan," I asked softly, "did you know about the seating arrangement beforehand?" His expression changed immediately. Not anger, not guilt exactly. Fear. Tiny, fleeting, but unmistakable. He looked down at his glass instead of answering right away. That silence told me everything I needed to know. "Mom, it was supposed to be a joke," he said finally. Nicole thought people would laugh. I stared at him quietly while music drifted through the ballroom behind us. "Hey, joke." There was a time when Ryan cried for 2 days because a boy mocked my haircut at his middle school graduation. My son once defended me fiercely over something far smaller than this. But people slowly become strangers long before we notice it happening. "Well," I said gently, "I suppose everyone has a different sense of humor." Ryan opened his mouth as though he wanted to explain further, but before he could speak, the wedding planner hurried across the ballroom toward Nicole, looking visibly alarmed. Even from a distance, I could see panic rising behind the woman's professional smile. Nicole's expression tightened immediately as the planner whispered something urgently into her ear. Then both women turned toward the reception desk near the ballroom entrance. Nicole's face lost color almost instantly, and for the very first time that evening, she looked uncertain. Nicole crossed the ballroom quickly in her satin gown, the train trailing behind her like spilled cream across the polished floor. The wedding planner followed closely beside her, carrying a tablet and several printed invoices. Even from my chair near the service doors, I could see the tight panic settling into Nicole's posture. She no longer looked like a radiant bride. She looked cornered. Ryan noticed it too. "Excuse me," he muttered before walking toward the reception desk. I watched the three of them gather beneath the soft golden lights near the ballroom entrance. The planner spoke carefully at first, clearly trying to remain professional, but Nicole's voice rose sharp enough that nearby guests began turning their heads. "That is impossible," she snapped. "Run the card again." The planner nodded nervously and typed something into the payment terminal. A few seconds later, she looked up with the same strained expression. Ryan stepped closer then, confusion replacing the exhaustion on his face. Nicole grabbed his arm tightly while whispering furiously into his ear. Across the ballroom, conversations began fading one table at a time as people sensed something unfolding. Wealthy weddings train people to notice financial embarrassment the way sailors notice incoming storms. Quietly, immediately, Grace sat beside me without speaking while we watched the scene continue near the entrance. A minute later, the band stopped playing in the middle of a song. The silence that followed felt enormous. Guests shifted awkwardly in their seats. One of the caterers disappeared toward the kitchen carrying a stack of unpaid vendor receipts pressed against his chest. Nicole turned suddenly toward Ryan with visible frustration. Even from across the room, I could read the anger forming behind her smile. Ryan pulled a credit card from his wallet and handed it to the planner. She tried again. Another long pause. Then another apologetic expression. Ryan's face slowly lost color. The planner finally handed him the tablet directly. He stared at the screen for several seconds before looking sharply toward Nicole. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Nicole crossed her arms immediately. "Defensive. Cornered people often become aggressive before they become honest." "I already told you," she hissed. "The bank must have frozen something." Ryan looked back down at the screen again. "Why are there charges from a cosmetic surgery clinic in Beverly Hills?" he asked. Several nearby guests went completely still. Nicole glanced around quickly before lowering her voice. But the ballroom had grown so quiet that pieces of the conversation still carried across the room. "I can explain that later," she snapped. Ryan continued scrolling. "And these credit accounts?" His voice sounded smaller now, more confused than angry. "Nicole, why are there 4 separate cards under my name?" A woman at the nearest table slowly set down her wine glass. Across the ballroom, Nicole's mother stood frozen beside the cake display, clutching her purse tightly against her side. Nicole finally lost patience entirely. "Because your mother was sitting on millions while we were drowning, trying to maintain appearances for your career," she burst out. The words landed hard inside the sudden silence. Nobody moved. Even the servers stopped walking for a moment. Ryan stared at her as though he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. Nicole realized too late how much she had revealed. Her breathing quickened, visibly while guests exchanged uncomfortable glances around the ballroom. Then her eyes shifted across the room and landed directly on me, still seated quietly near the kitchen doors. Still calm, still watching. For the first time since I had known her, Nicole looked genuinely afraid. The ballroom remained silent long after Nicole stopped speaking. It was the kind of silence that only exists after people accidentally reveal the truth they spent years trying to hide. Ryan still stood near the reception desk, holding the payment tablet in one hand while staring at his wife, like a man waking up inside someone else's life. Nicole's breathing had become uneven now. Her perfect composure was cracking beneath the weight of too many exposed lies. Around the room, guests carefully avoided eye contact with one another while pretending to focus on half-empty champagne glasses and untouched wedding cake. Nobody wanted to be the first person to react. Wealthy people are often deeply uncomfortable around public embarrassment unless they are the ones causing it. Grace touched my arm gently. "You do not owe anyone a scene," she whispered. I nodded slowly before rising from the folding chair for the first time in nearly 3 hours. The metal legs scraped softly against the ballroom floor. Several heads turned immediately. I adjusted the sleeves of my navy dress and picked up my clutch purse carefully. My knees ached slightly from sitting so long near the service entrance, but I walked steadily toward the center of the ballroom anyway. The chandeliers reflected above me in warm gold patterns while every conversation faded completely into silence. Ryan looked stricken as I approached. Nicole looked terrified. Strange how quickly arrogance disappears once money stops protecting it. I stopped beside the family table where my missing chair still had not been replaced. The empty space remained there like a quiet confession everyone could finally see clearly now. I looked first at Ryan, then at Nicole, then slowly around the ballroom filled with guests pretending not to listen. You know, I said softly, Robert used to believe weddings revealed more truth about families than funerals ever did. Nobody spoke. I rested one hand lightly against the back of an empty chair and continued calmly. Funerals are about grief, but weddings are about expectations, about status, about who gets included and who quietly gets pushed aside once appearances become more important than love. Nicole lowered her eyes. Ryan looked physically ill. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. There was no need. Some truths arrive quietly enough to make shouting unnecessary. Tonight, I said gently, I learned exactly where I stand in my own family. My gaze shifted briefly toward the ballroom entrance where the silver trash can had disappeared hours earlier. Earlier this evening, someone thought it would be amusing to remove my seat and replace it with something disposable. A few uncomfortable faces lowered toward the tables immediately. At my age, I continued, you eventually understand that humiliation says far more about the person creating it than the person receiving it. The room remained completely still. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. Ryan finally stepped forward slightly. Mom, he began weakly, but I lifted one hand softly to stop him. No, I said. Please let me finish. I turned toward Nicole then. Her mascara had begun smudging slightly beneath her eyes, though she still tried desperately to maintain control over her expression. You spent years treating kindness like weakness, I said quietly. You mistook patience for blindness. And you confused access with entitlement. Nicole swallowed hard, but said nothing. I offered her a small, almost sympathetic smile. The unfortunate thing about treating people like garbage, I said gently, is that eventually the trash gets taken out. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a woman inhaled sharply. Ryan closed his eyes completely for a brief moment, as though something inside him had finally collapsed. Nobody stopped me as I walked away from the center of the ballroom that night. In fact, the crowd slowly parted without a single word, creating a clear path between the family table and the exit doors near the lobby. I could feel hundreds of eyes following me beneath the warm chandelier light. But for the first time in years, I did not feel small under anyone's attention. I felt free. Grace quietly gathered my coat and purse before catching up beside me near the marble staircase leading toward the hotel entrance. Behind us, the reception had dissolved into tense clusters of whispered conversations and embarrassed silence. The band had not resumed playing. Ryan called my name once from across the ballroom, but his voice sounded distant now, almost unfamiliar. I paused briefly near the doors without turning around. There was a time when hearing my son sound distressed would have shattered me completely. But love changes when it spends too many years standing beside disrespect. Mom, please, Ryan said again, finally reaching me near the lobby. His tuxedo jacket hung slightly crooked now, and his face looked pale beneath the soft hotel lighting. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to wait for me after school with untied sneakers and scraped knees. But adulthood reveals character eventually. And tonight, I had finally seen his clearly. I did not know things had gotten this bad, he said quietly. I studied him for several seconds before answering. That is because you stopped paying attention a long time ago. Ryan lowered his eyes immediately. Behind him, Nicole remained frozen near the ballroom entrance while her parents argued in hushed voices with the wedding planner. Vendors moved through the room collecting unopened champagne bottles and half-finished floral arrangements. Expensive evenings collapse very quickly once the illusion holding them together disappears. Daniel Mercer will be contacting you both next week, I said calmly. There will be changes regarding the trust and all future financial arrangements. Ryan's expression tightened with sudden panic. Mom, wait. That is not necessary. I almost smiled at that. People rarely call consequences unnecessary until they begin facing them personally. Your father spent his final months trying to protect me, I said softly. I think it is time I finally respected the effort he made. Ryan looked over his shoulder toward Nicole again. Even now, part of him still seemed pulled toward her chaos, like a man standing too close to deep water. Some people confuse rescue with loyalty until they drown trying to save someone who never intended to stop sinking. I touched Ryan's arm gently one last time. You are not a cruel man, I told him quietly. But weak people often become dangerous because they allow cruel people to make decisions for them. Tears filled his eyes instantly, though he said nothing back. There was nothing left to say. 3 months later, Ryan filed for legal separation after discovering additional debts Nicole had hidden throughout their marriage. Daniel successfully removed all financial access connected to the Carter Trust, and the family home was transferred entirely under my independent protection. I sold the Naples condo that winter and purchased a small coastal cottage in South Carolina with white shutters and a porch facing the Atlantic Ocean. Grace moved only 20 minutes away, and every Thursday morning we drink coffee beside the water while watching gulls drift across the shoreline. Sometimes Ryan calls. Sometimes I answer. Healing does not always look dramatic at my age. Sometimes it simply looks like peace returning slowly to rooms that spent too many years holding tension. Last week, while arranging books in my new living room, I realized something quietly remarkable. For the first time in years, I no longer felt the need to earn a place at anyone else's table.